Yeah, so this talked about the cross, talked around the gospel a little bit. So the another question I get is this. I have a whole story related to a friend of mine named Brady. He told me a story about his time in a jury box related to a lawyer who basically said to him, "It's like, well, you're a pastor, you won't judge anybody, right?" And Brady's response was, "Well, I believe the Lord is just; He will judge people rightly." And the lawyer's response, "Well, you believe in that Old Testament God, This is
Mm.
Louisiana for you. Like, I want to do a big old
Yeah,
drawl with this. Um,
yeah.
oh, here's the
You want
issue:
to
is
be
that
you want to be Michael Scott on that episode of The Office where they're doing the Southern
uh
game.
huh.
Yeah.
So is since we see very little of narratives like you get in the Old Testament. I know there's a comparison to Acts and Sapphira. I know there's comparisons there. It's still just not the same level going on in a sense where you just see like, oh, like there's no right letter of New Testament. Yes, God burnt down this church with the people in it because of
Mm.
their idolatry, right? Like you don't see it
Okay.
in the same
Okay. It's
light.
the Patriot. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't think about that, but um, that completely historically accurate. Not really.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course.
That so is there a difference between how God judges in the Old Testament versus New Testament? And I
Mm.
think of passages like this, um, Luke 13. It talks about how there was some who told Jesus about the Galileans who blood Pilate mingled with their sacrifices. And it
Yeah.
talks about the Tower of Solomon falling on people. And they basically ask who is the worst sinner. And I'm like, well, this is like the obvious response because like they're reading their Old Testament, right?
Yeah.
They're reading their Old Testament. They see, oh, when you're a wicked sinner, like God's just gonna cut you down. To quote some Johnny
Yeah.
Cash, I don't think he wrote that song, but
Okay. Okay.
that's what I
Great
think
song.
of. That's what I think of when I think of that song. So
Yeah. Well, it's also John 9, isn't it? Who was the greater sinner, Lord?
yeah,
This man who was born blind or his parents? They just assume, they just assume that some kind of pain or some kind of suffering is because of sin, and because of personal sin in the individual. So, but to get to the question, and I think this was my favorite of the questions to kind of think about, because I think that it gets to, as far as I can tell, if I could oversimplify the message of the Bible, the nature of the Old Testament's um, purpose is different than the nature of the New Testament's purpose. And what I mean is this: um, in the Old Testament, sin is being put on display for what it is. I think that when Paul talks in the New Testament about how the knowledge of sin comes by the law, he doesn't just mean that when I look at the tables, I see it as a mirror. Um, I think that he means by the entirety of the Old Testament narrative, sin is put on display. Jesus himself quotes from the Psalms in John 10, I think it is, and he calls it the law. So the law is not just referring to the
yeah.
Ten Commandments or the Pentateuch, but it's talking about the whole thing. Sin is on display all through the Old Testament, so of course we're going to see the judgment of God and the wrath of God all often, which we do because sin is being put on display. In the New Testament, when you get there, you're reading what Irenaeus refers to as recapitulation. There's a big word where Jesus is reliving the life that Adam should have lived. We'll put it this way. Let me rephrase. He's reliving the life that Adam lived, but he's doing it perfectly. The life that Israel lived, but he's doing it perfectly. The life that all the godly lived, but nevertheless with sin, and he's doing it perfectly. So he's without sin. And so, therefore, the Father says, "This is my Son with whom I'm well pleased," multiple times, actually, the baptism and the transfiguration. And so, but the irony is that the wrath of God goes on him. That's the ultimate display of the wrath of God in the New Testament is on him at the cross. And then later on, in Revelation. That's when we see the judgment of God over the nations and all of that,
Yeah.
but the safety of those who are in Christ. So I guess my point is, the Old Testament is putting sin on display all the time, and so God in His holy nature cannot be pleased with what He's seeing happening on the earth all the time. So He's going to be responding in His holiness with wrath. In the New Testament, Christ pleases Him every step of the way, and so we might not see the wrath of God on display near as much in the New as in the Old.
Yeah. Because again, the narratives that come up are Ananias and Sapphira. It comes up with the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians,
Mm-hmm.
where it talks about how they take it in an unworthy manner.
Yep.
And
Yep.
some of you have died because of that.
Yep. Which, by the way, I'm pretty sure I've seen before in person. Like people who were coming to church, taking the Lord's Supper regularly with hatred, bitterness in their hearts for other people in the church, and they got sick, and they couldn't come back to church until there was repentance.
Yeah. And I think there are still, again, that's the issue, is that I don't think God's nature has changed. I think that and you kind of said this, I think that the characteristics of the writing of the New Testament are different too, because we get so much of writing letters to New Testament churches in order to for their
believers
to
who
grow.
are in Christ.
Yeah.
So
the four narratives that we have, basically, right? And you get narratives in like Galatians, and you get some narratives other places too. Paul talking about we went here and went here, but mainly you have this instruction and teaching, and then even in the Gospels, you see the Lord's year of Lord's favor come to pass, right? It's what Luke 4 is. So like, when Jesus is walking around, you shouldn't expect all, just fiery, fireballs falling down. Everybody, he was there to set the captives free, right? So it was he had to reclaim the year of the Lord's favor, according to Isaiah. So then you're right. You get this real harsh Old Testament style. I want to make an argument that Revelation is framed over and over again in Old Testament prophetic language. These Old Testament style judgment. Old Testament style judgments.
Which, by the way, you know what? No, I'm going to take that back. I don't want to get into that. There's probably a lot there. That's a rabbit trail. But
okay.
That's a rabbit trail. Forget what I said.
Yeah. So, I think that's one of the important aspects of having Revelation in the New Testament canon is the idea of justice. God is still just. God will still judge rightly. And I'm pretty sure the First Thessalonians right here, like it talks about basically when the Lord's going to return and judge all things. Like it's a very clear theme of First Thessalonians. You get it in First Peter, you get it in the New Testament. You just don't get descriptions and narratives like you do in the Old Testament. I think there's just still pointing towards.
Yeah. So I would say not only Revelation, but the examples that you brought up of Ananias and Sapphira. I can't even hear the names Ananias and Sapphira without hearing their names in Shia Lin's voice. Ananias and Sapphira lied to you, so you put them both to death to show the world what a holy God could do.
That's good.
You could hear that in Shia Lin's voice. Anyway, Ananias and Sapphira, Herod when he's up speaking, and the people say, "Oh, it's the voice of a god," and then he's struck down right there on the spot. The fact that Saul is redemptively, struck off the horse, and eventually, he's saved. But that's quite the smackdown, as it were, right there for him. And Jesus judges the fig tree. That's one example. There's probably more that we could get to, but like you said, taking the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner, there's judgment that comes from that. All of these are examples that God's not changed. and the nature of sin
No.
has not changed. But the nature of the New Testament's purpose in the economy of God is that of fulfillment and salvation, the year of the Lord's favor, like you said, having come into the world. And it's interesting you mentioned that, because so you were mentioning Luke 4 with its quote from Isaiah 61. We're just looking in Sunday school this past Sunday at Matthew 12, which quotes Isaiah 42, and so Matthew 12:18. It's commenting. So Matthew's quoting Isaiah because he's wanting to explain why it is that Jesus was repeatedly withdrawing from people and telling people who he healed and all of that to not, tell everybody about it. Keep it quiet is basically what he's saying. And this was to fulfill verse 17, what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. Behold my servant whom I've chosen, my beloved with whom my soul is well pleased. That's now that's the second time that Matthew says that God is pleased in his son. But it's it's the second of three times. So my beloved with whom my soul is well pleased, I'll put my spirit upon him. So it's definitely hearkening back to the baptism. Spirit comes down, this is my beloved, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He'll not quarrel or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he won't break, a smoldering wick he won't quench. We could talk about that. It's one of my favorite things in the whole New Testament. Until he brings justice to victory, and in him the Gentiles will hope. Now, we hear justice, and we have ideas of what that means. We think that means the righting of all wrongs socioeconomically in the world.
Yeah.
Jesus is healing people and casting out demons and showing mighty works. And Matthew is saying that is him bringing justice to the world.
Yeah.
What does that mean if it doesn't mean that he's setting right that which has gone wrong in God's creation? And so, judgment is not just the meting out of punishment for wrong on people who are doing crimes or injustices or something like that. But it's setting right what's wrong. I'm kind of getting to NT Wright language here about bringing the world to rights, basically.
Yeah,
that's
we're back
everything
to Romans
that
8
Jesus
again.
is doing in the New Testament.
Yeah, we're back to Romans 8. Is that all this fallenness and brokenness in the world will be one day fixed.
That's right. That's right.
We want to go down a whole road.
New Testament is saying that Christ is fixing it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to go down a whole road. We don't need to go all the way down this, but recognition. One of the things I didn't just popped in my head when I wrestled through this question earlier, I didn't think about was the judgment over Jerusalem. In Luke 21, Jesus, proclaims that this is all just going to get torn down, and it happens. Some years later, depending on how you judge Jesus, the date of Jesus' death, let's say 40 years later, give or take 5 years, whatever it would be, right? He clearly proclaims an Old Testament style judgment over Israel for their rebellion against the Lord. Just wanted to mention that.
And like that is Matthew 23 with all the woes. He just goes on and on with woes. That's Isaiah 13 to 21 or 22, I think it is, where it's just woe to, Damascus, to Syria, to all these. So he's God's still the same. God speaks the same. So
I'm in middle of Ezekiel. I'm around chapter 30 right now. It's right in the middle of the judgment of the nations. Tyre and Sidon and Egypt. And I could just Jesus sounds just like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, right? With the judgment of the nations. So this is the other thing that we get. Like I said before, we get descriptions of God's judgment and justice and wrath in even in the New Testament. This is 1 Thessalonians 1:9. For they themselves report concerning us the kind of reception we had among you. This is Paul talking about the Thessalonians, how you turn from God to God from idols to serve the living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come.
Yeah.
So like New Testament idea, right? That there's wrath coming.
Yeah.
So all that said, even I agree with you in the principle, like there are different frameworks going on in the Old Testament and New Testament. That does not mean that God's character is different. It does not mean the plan of redemption is somehow different. If we're going to you've already said this, right? We're not making a complete tearing apart of the Old Testament, New Testament, and putting it on other sides of the room. We're saying they go together, but ultimately the framework is changed in a sense with the coming of Christ.
I think so. Staying in Paul, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all godlessness, Romans 1. Talking about in Ephesians 2, people who are by nature children of wrath. Because sin has been made clear in the Old Testament what sin is, the New Testament can therefore give how do I put this? Forceful, lucid diagnosis of humanity's problem. And so, whereas in the Old Testament, it might not refer to people who live with covetousness and idolatry as children of wrath, although I'm sure that we could probably find some texts that at least imply that. The New Testament is crystal clear because now sin has been made clear, and so therefore we understand that those in sin are under wrath. That's John 3:36. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son, you remember how it finishes. The wrath of God remains on him.
Remains. Yeah. So, and I think at John 3:17 is where my mind went first, was that they're condemned already because they had not believed in the Son, right? That I mix those two together in my head. But so the wrath of God remains. It's a good word.
Yeah, it's already on them. 2 chapters later, Jesus says that whoever believes in me, John 5:24, I think it is, whoever believes in me does not come under judgment, but they've passed from death to life. So the idea is that death is the state of humanity, stuck in sin, enslaved to sin. Christ comes into the world to save the world. So by taking wrath on himself to save us and to redeem us and all of that, therefore, like we should, I guess I should just say this: we shouldn't be surprised if there is maybe a different tenor or a different tone to the New Testament in some ways, because it's the next chapter in the story, essentially, where everything in the old is fulfilled. There being continuities shows that God is the same, sin is the same, all of that. But there being some discontinuities just simply shows what I would say is escalation, where the story has escalated. Now it's come to its highest point, and we're still waiting on it to go even higher when Christ returns.
So last couple of minutes here. I think of so many instances where, like, I find myself having this phrasing all the time with so many aspects of the Christian life and so many people I deal with, is that where people jump into the extremes. That's what I mean by this. So like I've found so many Christians who are, I would say, indifferent towards their sin, right? They're careless towards it, right? There's just so much. There's conviction, but it's minimal, right? I say they've hardened their hearts. They're trying to, like, again, we don't want to get into issues about assurance and all that stuff, but let's say they have a confession of faith and, like, there's just very little conviction. I think I deal with that on a regular basis. Let's talk about the other extreme. Recent story, like, she would never watch this, I don't think. Older lady called me out. This is actually like a month before I left my previous context. I was in the middle of going to a trip somewhere or doing something with my family, and older lady calls me up and basically, like, I haven't been going to church enough. I haven't been giving like consistently enough. God has like, I don't think this is how she framed it exactly, but like a testing spirit on her is how I'd frame it, right? She couldn't sleep at night. She was just so like afraid of God.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I think of that kind of person. I think of the person who has a confession of faith and has grown in their faith, but they struggle with the idea of that God is just waiting the very next moment, like a very, very angry father, just to say, "Oh yeah, I knew you were going to do that.
Yeah.
You're an idiot. You're a fool. Like, what's wrong with you? I hate that kind of mentality." If you have a person with that kind of like sensitive conscience,
Yeah.
related to God's wrath and God anger, even though you don't want to lessen God's justice and judgment, how do you care for that person's soul?
Yeah, it's an important question. I'd say the first thing would be don't write off the person's um, feelings in that kind of situation, because those are deeply personal um, wounds that are probably driving that. Um,
Yeah,
so we don't want to write it off, and we don't want to be dismissive. We want to try to come alongside a person. And secondly, in this is the most important part, is reminding them of God's nature. I just think that recognizing God as Trinity, Him being eternally Father and Son, before there was ever anything to rule and to have um, wrath over, God was loving Father and loving Son. Um, he does not therefore have to be provoked to love. I think I heard Ray Rutland say it like this one time. He's got to be provoked to wrath. He doesn't have to be provoked to love, because he's Trinity. Um,
yeah,
and I just think that we tend to think of God like a despot before anything else. Like, we think that
yeah,
he's just a lawgiver. No, he is a lawgiver. Of course he is. But he's a lawgiver because he's a creator, and he's a creator because he's a father who is generous, and he wants to have creation to display his glory in, and have people who he can establish fellowship with. So this is, that's maybe deep theologically, but I guess my point is that when the scripture says that he doesn't chastise forever, Lamentations 3, and when it says that he only disciplines those whom he regards as his sons, in the case of this woman, daughter, um, what is behind those statements is the understanding that he's a father before anything else, and
yeah,
and a good father, the best father, the archetype of all fathers, God Himself um, is not ever trying to hurt His children.
yeah,
He's always wanting to help them and to save them, and to give them the very best that they could ever possibly have. And so if a person says, well, I have a hard time believing that, I just would say, um, first, remember the cross. Remember the cost that God was willing to pay to bring you to Himself. And then secondly, be patient. I tell people, read the Psalms every day. Be in the Psalms every day. How many people through the Psalms had those kind of sentiments?
yeah,
Where are you, Lord? I remember, God, and I moan, is what the psalmist says. My eye wastes away because of grief. Darkness has become my only friend. How many people have been there and it felt like the wrath of God was on them? And so they cry out to Him. I think it was Ed Welch who said once that when we read that in the Psalms, that's God giving us words when we don't have words. And we might even say that that's an example of what Paul says in Romans 8 about how the Spirit intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. When we don't know what to pray for as we ought, God gives us in the Scriptures His Spirit-inspired writing
yeah,
words when we don't even have words. So
yeah,
I would say, we don't write them off. We remind them of God's fatherly nature before anything else. Um, we tell them that we're going to pray for them. We invite them into the Psalms every day, and God will meet with them there. And those are at least hopefully helpful starting points.
Yeah, and the recognition. The thing I'd add to that is the recognition that like it doesn't happen. Like the struggle that you're having right now might not change in the flip of a switch, right? Like that.
That's why I say like be patient. Be patient.
Yeah,
you have to. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. I thought you meant like the person counseling needs to be patient. I agree, but like you're saying also inwardly yourself, you need to be patient, because this may be a month-long, week-long, year-long struggle, and with ups and downs, where you're really struggling to wrestle through Scripture. Yeah. And I want to say that, and I just found so many times, even though it's kind of upsetting in the midst of it, like how meaningful it was. So we had a guy, for those listening, we had a guy named Roger. He used to be the BCM director at Indiana State.
I just was thinking about him earlier today. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that like I remember at different times in our life, he had told us both, like, you're in a good place right now. And I was oddly, like, it is simultaneously upsetting and comforting, right?
Yeah, right.
Because the thought is that the Lord could use this time for you to gain a deeper trust. I also think of Bunyan's "Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners," and him wrestling with the end of Hebrews about Esau losing his birthright, and he wrestled with that compared to like, well, I lost myself. I never had my salvation in the first place. I just went through the motions, and I would say the level of introspection that he had would be a negative thing, but ultimately, because of that wrestling, I think he would have came to a more solidified faith. In the midst of that struggle. So that's really good.
By the way, when I was just going to say quickly, when I anytime I'm teaching through the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, there's the kingdom of heaven, etc., I define the word blessed, makarios, it's a word that could be translated happy or cheerful or something like that. I define it according to Roger's terminology. You're in a good place.
That's good.
I say what Jesus means is that you're in a good place if you're poor in spirit. You're in a good place if you hunger and thirst for righteousness. And I think about him every time I'm teaching through that.
Cool. That's cool. So one of the things I like to say is that if anybody watches this who are connected to our churches or to us, and you are really struggling through this problem, and you perceive, whether on an intellectual level of like, how do I wrestle through this, or on a personal level that you feel God's angry towards you, please send us a message. Please call us. Please talk to us. Be clear. I know if anybody's still watching after an hour, they stuck it through. Like really, like again, we don't have some grandiose picture or purpose for this. One of the goals is to help the people we know wrestle through these big problems. Yeah, it really is. So thanks for this, Scott. Talk to you later.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, if you're wrestling through that, struggling through it, again, I'll just say it again. You're in a good place. Jesus gave an invitation to all those who are weary and heavy laden to come and find rest. Part of that is if you're weary and heavy laden trying to figure out God and how to relate to God. Jesus says, come and learn from me. Take my yoke. You will find rest as you learn from me. That doesn't mean that you're going to get it immediately. That as you walk with me, you'll find it in time.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, guys.